Hello and welcome back to Fish Anything. For those of you who've been watching my channel for a while, you know that I love ultralight fishing. And obviously I use a lot of micro presentations and cast really small jigs and catch all sorts of different fish species. And one of the questions that I get all the time is, Ethan, how do you effectively cast such light lures? And that's exactly what I wanted to talk about today. I've got a couple tips to share with you to help you cast more effectively with micro presentations. And when I say that, I'm talking about like less than 1/16 of an ounce, not a 1/8 ounce jig. That's obviously pretty easy to cast on most equipment, but a 1/64 ounce jig, that's kind of challenging. And if you use the right techniques, you can do it, but if you're using the wrong techniques, you're gonna have a hard time. So I wanna share some of the technical aspect of casting ultralight lures, and then by the end of this video, hopefully you can cast them effectively and catch all sorts of fish, because let's face it, those micro presentations sometimes can catch fish better than just about anything out there. So without further ado, let's jump into it.
I've got 4 ultralights with me, mostly just for demonstration's sake, because quite frankly, before I even get into like the casting techniques and that sort of thing, I'm gonna tell you, gear hands down is what I need to talk about today. 20% of it's probably your casting, techniques and that sort of thing. But the reality is, if you're not using the right gear, you're just never gonna get the right distance. I'm gonna go ahead and start with this one right here. So before I even make a cast, I wanna talk through what I'm doing. I've got a 1/64 ounce mule jig right here with a Mule Minnow 1.2. It does not get much lighter than that. That is a micro presentation through and through. I cannot stress this enough. Gear is everything. You've got rod, line, and reel. I would say the reel is probably the least important of the 3, but it's still important. What I look for in a reel, I've actually got a video on that, so you can watch that separate if you'd like. But generally speaking, what I look for is something that's gonna balance effectively with my rod and something that does not have too narrow of a spool diameter. So when I'm talking about spool diameter, I'm talking about how wide this is right here. If it's too narrow, that's gonna create more memory with the line. It's gonna reduce the casting ability. Now, again, I don't want something that's gonna be super big, because then it's gonna be really clunky. It's not gonna balance well. It's gonna be, uncomfortable to cast. And I feel like you're actually gonna get less distance as a byproduct of that. Generally speaking, with ultralight or light rods, I'm gonna go with a size 1000 or 2000 or the equivalent, depending on what brand you use. In this case, this is a 13 fishing reel. I actually don't like this reel that much, but functionally it's doing the exact same thing as some of my favorite reels. Most spinning reels are pretty much the same with regards to casting distance, I would say. Now, let's move on to the rod, because it's much more important than the reel. Ultimately, when it comes to using tiny lures, some of the big things you want to look for are the specs. Now, in this case, this rod is rated for 1/32 to 3/16 ounce lures, and they call this an ultralight. This is a fast action rod. This one happens to be the Dobbin Sierra. The big thing that I got to call out here is we're talking ultralight here. So when it comes down to it, you cannot use anything above a light rod and expect to cast these tiny presentations very far, because anything above a light rod is probably going to be rated for, a 1/4 ounce and up, or so on and so forth. Now, it's very, very rare to find a rod that is rated anything less than 1/32 ounce. But I would say anything in that realm of rated from 1/32 and up is usually going to do pretty good with these micro presentations. That being said, some of the things that I'm going to be specifically looking for is how much does that rod tip load up when I try to cast it. And in this case, this Dobbins is extremely fast, but at the same time, it has enough of a soft tip to where when I go to cast something really small like this, that rod tip loads up. Now, why is that important? That's important because imagine, let's just use a metaphor. If I go to jump, I'm probably gonna jump, 2 feet off the ground, just straight up off the, cement. I'm just gonna jump off the cement. I'm gonna jump 2 feet off the ground. If I jump and then bounce off of a trampoline, I'm probably gonna jump 3 or 4 feet in the air. Well, the rod tip is that same purpose. If it loads up, it's gonna give it more spring, and it's gonna help that jig shoot out there. If you're using too stout of a rod, or a rod that is not rated effectively for those lighter lures, it's not gonna load up at all. And the only thing you're gonna be casting is the jig. You're gonna have nothing helping you. So a good ultralight or light power rod is going to load up on that micro presentation, and it's gonna assist with the cast. Now, the last aspect to gear that I find extremely important, probably the most important, is line. Now, in this case, I've got some 2-pound fluorocarbon on there, but what I'm looking for when it comes to line is something low diameter. I also want something that has virtually no memory. When I'm talking about memory, I'm talking about something that's gonna coil up after you cast it. I've used braids in the past that do have that. Fireline is an example that I found had a lot of memory, and I did not like it, and it was not effective at casting micro presentations. Daiwa J-braid has very low memory and it casts micro presentations really well. Same thing goes with Spro Finesse braid. Generally speaking, I like braid and I like mono. In this case, I'm using fluorocarbon just because I'm continuing to experiment. But the reason I don't typically like fluorocarbon is not because of casting distance, because it does cast extremely well. It's more so due to the fact that it's very brittle and I find that it breaks much easier than mono. So I like mono because it reduces my headaches on the water. That being said, what I want to call out is the lower the diameter, the farther the casting distance, generally speaking. And that is why I typically use 2-pound monofilament as opposed to 4-pound. And I know some people probably don't want to go as low as 2-pound because it is, you know, quite small and it will potentially break. But I will tell you that in my experience, 2-pound monofilament probably outcasts 4-pound by 15 to 20%. It makes a substantial difference. Okay, I finally made a cast. Now, in this case, I just casted that 1/64th ounce jig with minuscule plastic. I don't know, probably 30 feet, so not too bad. Now in that case, the line actually got a little bit more wet and I casted it probably another 10 feet. That is something that you definitely want to pay attention to. As you start casting your jig, make sure that line starts to get a little bit wet, because what happens is it seems to cast further as the line gets more wet, especially with braid, but I would say across the board. One thing that I totally forgot to mention that I wanted to talk about with rods is length. Now this Dobbins right here is a 6'2" rod and this Temple Fork is a 7 foot. And as far as specs go, they have the exact same specs, 1/32 through 3/16. They're both fast action and they're both ultralights. But the difference is I find that the Dobbins can actually cast lighter lures more effectively. And that all comes down to that tip. What I've found generally speaking across longer ultralights, so anything above 6'6", I find that their rod blank starts to bend a little bit lower in the blank. And what happens is they're usually, I would say, built for slightly larger jigs. And so I find that with ultralight, like true micro ultralight jigs, like 1/64th, they don't do quite as well because they just don't load up the same. So this rod right here, wonderful ultralight, I really do love it, but I typically like to use it with stuff like a 1/16th or a 3/32, and I typically use it more so for like crappie applications. I would say I can still cast that micro stuff, but generally speaking, it makes it just a little bit harder and it probably doesn't get the same distance. So I guess what my point is even though in most cases, the longer your rod, the more casting distance you have, I would say that's not necessarily the case for micro lures because of the fact that most ultralight rods over 6'6" start to get just a little bit more whippy and they just don't cast quite as effectively. So what I am saying is that generally speaking, I would recommend about a 6-foot rod if you want to maximize your casting distance with ultralight. The rods that are less than 6 foot typically cast shorter than the rods at 6 foot. But then once you get above 6 foot or 6'6", I find that the rods just get a little bit too beefy and they don't cast it quite as effectively. So the sweet spot to me is anywhere from about 5'10" to 6'4". If you can find a rod in that length that still has a fast action and a soft tip, it usually will effectively cast the lures the best. Now that I've talked extensively about gear selection, you can absolutely ask me questions in the comments below about gear if you'd like, but let's get to some of the casting techniques. So I'm not going to tell you that my casting techniques are that much different than most experienced anglers, but the thing that is certainly something that I see wrong in a lot of, ultralight fishermen in my experience is the fact that people hold back. I think a lot of anglers are used to casting a Senko or a jig for bass, and quite frankly, those lures are pretty heavy and they're pretty easy to cast. But when it comes to micro presentations, you have to give a little bit more flick of that wrist. So when I go to cast this, I am not holding back. I am casting hard and I'm using a lot of wrist motion. So if you saw that, I just probably casted that out there 45 feet, but I used a lot of flick of that wrist. I really casted it hard. I'm not necessarily winding up and trying to swing for the moon, but at the same time, at the end of my cast, I'm really putting a lot of wrist flick. And what happens is it helps shoot that jig forward. And it creates a lot of inertia, and that little tiny jig, despite the fact that it doesn't weigh very much, it goes out there quite a ways because I'm using my wrist to work with the rod tip that loads up on that jig. And by doing that, I'm giving it the most amount of velocity it's going to have, and I'm getting it out there as far as I possibly could. Oh, there's a bite. Got him. Oh, it's a micro. It's a micro, but it's a fish. May not be much, but at least we're on the board. I mean, the water temps are really dropping. It's very still out here today, kind of overcast. And I don't know what the water temps are, but they're not much. I'll take a dinky bluegill though. At least I caught something. You know, I typically do like a roll cast, so I'm gonna kind of go like this. I'm gonna cast it underhand at an angle, but the same principle applies with the flick of that wrist if you're casting overhead too. I like the roll cast. I find that I get a little bit more loft on it and it usually goes a little bit further, but I still use an overhead cast quite often as well. Just kind of depends on where I'm aiming. The other thing that I will note is how much line between the jig and the rod tip when you go to cast. If you have that jig too close to the rod tip, it's not going to allow that rod tip to really help spring it forward. But if you have too much line out there like this, it's going to be kind of clunky and you're going to go to cast and it's just going to be kind of awkward and it's not going to cast very effectively. So I'd say, generally speaking, anywhere from about 24 to 30 inches of line is kind of the sweet spot for maximizing distance when it comes to how far off the rod tip you want your jig. Again, I just launched it out there as far as I could possibly ask for such a micro jig. Now this is that Spro braid, and one of the things that I really like about it is it's extremely smooth. It doesn't have like a gritty feel to it. Some braids are like a little gritty feeling, and I find that that super smooth braid like this, it just seems to fly off the reel, and I can cast really far with it. There he is. What's this? Another dinky bluegill. All right. There you go. It ain't much, but I'll take it. Man, he's freezing cold. I just wish we had a couple more months of warm weather, but here in Michigan, we're running out of warm water. There he is. Oh, it's a perch. All right. We've got 3 absolute dinks, but we've got 2 species now. 1 micro perch and 2 micro bluegill. See ya, bud. Not really fair to do a casting distance video if I don't physically measure how far I can cast. I'm gonna keep my feet right behind this stick. That stick is my starting point. I'm just gonna cast it as far forward as I can. All right, what's the best way to do this? Honestly, I don't even know where my jig is. Oh, I'm moving it. I'm stepping all over the line. What a goober. Yeah, I'm all tangled up. What an idiot. This was a bad idea. Okay, well that's great. I need to be on a football field or something. Okay, I was all tangled up. Well, either way, let's do a quick measurement. Okay, this stick is roughly right here. This is a 25-foot tape, so I'm gonna have to bring it in. That was 24 feet. Whoa! Okay, 24 feet from right there. Roughly 41 feet. Now that's obviously extremely rough, but that's what I've been kind of estimating on my cast, anywhere from 35 to 45 feet. So I guess I'm pretty good at estimating. We'll make another cast or two. That way we can, you know, test it again, but I'd say roughly 40 to 42 feet of distance. Not too bad. Overhead. This was the dumbest possible way of testing the casting distance, but we did it this way nonetheless. It was roughly in here. Now I'll just measure my way back to the stick. So that was about 38 feet. So again, 40 feet of distance. You just have to kind of temper your expectations. I think some people are probably going to hear 40 feet and they're going to be like, well, that's not very far. The reality is we're talking about a 1/64th ounce jig. You're never going to get 100 feet of casting distance. Well, we haven't exactly caught any units today. But to be fair, I'm pretty sure there's other things that I probably could be doing to catch better fish. But there you go, it's a little bit better bluegill, still tiny. 4 fish though, and I've been out here for a whopping like 30 minutes and I don't have much more time. I really mostly just wanted to go over these techniques because I really felt it was important, and I know there's a lot of people curious. Hey, what's this? That is a crappie. Not a bad one either. Well, not a big one, but I'll take it. I think that's a white crappie. Yeah, it's definitely a white crappie. Got the vertical bars, a little bit longer, skinnier body. I can even count the spikes for you. 1 dorsal spine, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 dorsal spines. I believe that would be a white crappie right there. All right. Well, it ain't much, but we've got 3 species on the day. There you go. This rod's not technically a micro presentation because this is a 1/16 ounce mule jig, which you should be able to cast quite far on any ultralight, no matter what line choice you use. But I want to catch one of these crappie. And this is a good little crappie rig. So I'm hoping we can find another slabby. Generally speaking, you would not think, yeah, I was gonna say, there's no way there's just one crappie here. Yeah, and this little bit larger presentation I find works quite well for crappie. I've had a lot of success on these little bit larger mule minnows, and I like pairing it up with that 1/16 ounce mule jig. I just find that I can present it exactly how I want. And there you go, another little white crappie. This line, I want to say this is like Varivas. I'm not sure how you say it. V-A-R-I-V-A-S. I got it for free. Oh, there's a fish. Oh, doesn't feel too bad actually. Oh, just a little crappie, I think. He took off with it. Anyways, this is like a 2.5 pound fluorocarbon, and it's very low profile. It's very low diameter, so it does cast really far. And that's a little black crappie right there on that tiny little jig. Whipped it out there quite a ways. See you, buddy. So like I said, it's that Varivas stuff. It's high quality stuff for sure. Like I said though, I'm just not huge on fluorocarbon less than 6 pound test. I like fluorocarbon for bass fishing. Anything less than 6 pound test, I just find it's super brittle. And if you get just a little kink in it, it's gonna snap. And so with mono, it's just a little more abrasion resistant. So I will typically prefer a mono, but I would say a fluorocarbon would probably outcast a mono because it is gonna be lower diameter. Oh man, I absolutely whipped that thing out there. They just suspend. There's like, oh yeah, there he is. Ooh, ooh, ooh. When they bend the dobbins like this, you know it's not gonna be tiny. It's gonna be a decent slab, I think. He's staying down. Oh, it's a, what is this? Oh my gosh. Oh, look at this slab. Oh my gosh. Elephants eat peanuts too, my friends. Holy smokes. That's a skinny dude. He's not that healthy, sadly. He needs to eat a real meal. That's a tank though, my goodness. Love it. Tiny little jig, nice slab. Wasn't necessarily expecting a big old slab like this. The best crappie I've caught here all year. It's been kind of a year of smaller crappies here on this lake. I just got a text from my wife and we've got some errands we need to run, so this is gonna be my last cast. All right. It's meant to be, oh yes, on the last cast, another one. Ooh, it's another nice one. Oh baby, another nice one. Big slabs out to play, not as big as the last, but still a solid, healthy fish. Nice little black crappie right there. Not too bad, not too bad.
Well, I know today's video was definitely short and sweet, but that was kind of the goal. I was out here for about an hour, caught some fish, but most importantly, I talked about a topic of conversation, which I've been meaning to talk to you guys about for like 6 months. I finally got around to making this video. I hope it helps. If you have any further questions, drop them in the comments below. But all in all, if you're gonna take one thing away from today's video, it's that line choice makes a huge impact, huge impact. If I would choose just one line, this Trilene Sensation in a 2-pound test, very budget friendly. It seems to outperform its strength. I mean, 2-pound test is something that can break really easily, but I've found that this holds up quite well to carp and all sorts of big random fish, and I've really enjoyed it. I think it costs just shy of $10 and it's 330 yards. So I am in no way affiliated with Berkley, but this is a product that I very much love and trust. I'll link it in the description, and then otherwise I'll link some other videos in the description that might be of help for you. Either way, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to stay tuned. We'll catch you next time.